My name is Matt Delacry, and when I was growing up, I missed out on some answers to some serious questions I was having. Join me as I seek answers to those questions. So, in the last episode, we left off with Jesus putting together a group of disciples. Now, unless what we know about him is wildly inaccurate, he just didn't get a group of guys together to hang out, drink some wine, and have some barbecue, not pork. If that's all he did, he probably wouldn't have made much of an impact, and we would have never known who he was. So he got this group together to do something. So what did he do? If you happened to be in town when Jesus was passing through, what would you see him doing? What would people think about him? Well, a lot of people put Jesus in the category of prophet. Now, a prophet is someone who speaks and acts on God's behalf. Now, whether Jesus was actually from God or not is another question. But as we're putting together this historical sketch of him, we need to get an idea of how people of the time would have viewed him. And the basic category most people would have put him in is prophet. Though, as we'll see in a bit, this category doesn't really contain him. Nevertheless, it's a good place to start. So prophets would often deliver messages from God. These might include warnings of coming disaster and/or coming deliverance. And prophets would also engage in both teaching and symbolic actions. Now, by symbolic actions, what I mean is that they would do things that were relatively unimportant in themselves, but they would symbolize something that was much bigger. For example, prophets might lead people into the wilderness, especially around the Jordan River, and do some things there. Remember John the Baptist? Now, the messages that prophets delivered were generally focused on how God would fulfill his promises. Some of those were good, promises of blessing if Israel did well, but some of those were bad, promises of cursing, i.e. bad stuff happening if, Israel did not do well. Now, the first major promise that would have been in the minds of people in the first century, at least Jewish people in the first century, was the return from exile. In the 6th century BC, Jerusalem had been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar II, and the people of Jerusalem were taken into captivity in Babylon. In the late 6th century BC, Cyrus the Great told the Jewish people that they could go back to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. Now, fast forward to Jesus' day in the 1st century AD. At that point, the Jewish people were in their homeland again, as God had promised they would be. However, they had not yet fully returned from exile. They were still being ruled by the Gentiles, and in the Jewish mind, if the people of God were still being ruled by outsiders, then God's promises had not yet been fulfilled. In other words, while they were living in the promised land, they had not actually returned from exile yet. This is why there were so many attempts at revolution by the Jews, and this is why you see so much in the Gospels about Israel's relationship to Rome. Jesus is regularly questioned about Israel's relationship to Rome, and more than once he is mistakenly thought to be leading a revolution against the Gentile overlords, which is what a lot of people wanted. However, this gets into the category of Messiah, and we'll talk about that in another episode. But the return of exile is what most Jews both wanted and expected, and this was a category that a prophet in that time would be probably expected to speak to. So a lot of what Jesus said and did would have put him in the category of prophet. And yet, there were a whole lot of other things that he did which would have been considered to be somewhere between extremely unusual and downright sinful by those same people. The religious leaders generally thought the latter. They thought he was downright sinful. For one, Jesus didn't fast, which would have been extremely unusual. This was a normal thing for people to do as part of their faith. And someone who is very religious, like a rabbi or teacher like Jesus was, would have fasted pretty regularly. But Jesus didn't. Jesus also hung out with all the wrong people. As we saw in the last episode, in his relationship to his disciples, Jesus had a loose connection with the idea of family. Or rather, he valued one's biological family quite a lot. But what he did was he valued one's spiritual family more. And this would have been thoroughly confusing as well as offensive to a group-oriented culture. And not only did he choose not to hang out with his family, the people he was replacing them with weren't the nice church-going types. Jesus hung out with sinners. In the first century, this was an actual category. It wasn't just a loose association of people. This was an actual category of people who were referred to as sinners, and there were a lot of people who fell into it. Basically, what it boils down to is people who were sinners were not considered respectable. So, from the religious leader's perspective, let me help you give you an idea of what this would have been like, or from any good Jew's perspective. So, think of your social circles, your friends, your family, your coworkers, and so forth. Now imagine you had a bunch of them over for a party or Thanksgiving dinner. What type of people would shock them the most if you brought some of them over? Maybe people who voted for the wrong person and have ridiculous views on the most important issues? Maybe people who have had trouble with the law? Maybe people who you think are just sleazy, scummy, or just plain messed up in the head. You know, the people I'm talking about, the people who are of that sort. Well, guess who Jesus hung out with? So he acted like a prophet on the one hand, and yet he did things like that. Well, besides hanging out with a bad crowd, Jesus seemed to be on the wrong side of the law. And I mean that in the strongest possible way, because we're talking about a world in which there was no separation between religion and politics. So when Jesus violated the law, he was violating the law. Let me give you a couple of examples. In Mark 7, Jesus gets into it with the religious leaders about hand washing. And so, hand washing back then had nothing to do with germs. This was almost 2,000 years before anybody knew what germs were. This was a ritual purity thing that you did for religious reasons. Now, some of the religious leaders saw Jesus' disciples eating food without washing their hands first, and they wanted to know why. In their view, eating with unwashed hands defiled a person. Again, this is a religious thing. It had nothing to do with germs. Jesus turned it back on them and said, quote, "Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men.' You leave the commandment of God and hold to the traditions of men." End quote. After this, Jesus pointed out how some of their traditions violated the commandments of God. Let me explain how. Now, back then there was no such thing as retirement savings or insurance. If you wanted to be able to eat and have a place to stay when you were old, you relied on your children, which is one reason why children were so important. However, what the religious leaders were doing was telling people that you could take that money and give it to God, i.e., donate it to the temple. And if you did that, you would no longer have any obligation to support your parents. So they were straight up telling people that they could chuck their parents out on the street as long as they gave the money that they would have given to their parents to the temple, the church. And that was good, and God would be pleased. Yeah, it was like that. But Jesus said, no, God told you to honor your father and mother, and by this neat little give to the church plan you have, you were violating the commandments of God. And then he goes into an explanation about what really defiles a person. It's about what goes out, not what comes in. What defiles you are the, quote, evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness, end quote, that come out of your heart. What goes in doesn't matter. It's what comes out. And Jesus would purposefully get himself into situations like this just to make a point. And Jesus' teachings often followed his actions. He did stuff that wouldn't sit right with people, and then his teachings were meant to explain why he did what he did. Even bigger than the hand-washing thing was what you were allowed and not allowed to do on the Sabbath. For those of you who don't know, the Sabbath, which is Saturday, or more specifically, sundown on Friday till sundown on Saturday, is the Jewish day of rest. You weren't supposed to do any work on that day because it was the Lord's day. And that was fine, but by the time Jesus lived, this had become a huge thing. The religious leaders were so concerned about breaking one of God's laws that they did what they called building a hedge around the law. It's like you're told, don't cross this line. And so you're super worried about not crossing this line. And you don't even want to cross it by accident. So what you do is you draw another line further back so that, even if you cross this new line by accident, then you definitely won't cross this original line. And over time, the lines kept being drawn further and further and further back. Enter Jesus. Let me read you one encounter Jesus had with the religious types in the synagogue church. From Mark 3, quote, "Again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, 'Come here.' And he said to them, 'Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?' But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, 'Stretch out your hand.' He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him." End quote. Jesus was regularly healing people miraculously on the Sabbath, and we'll talk about miracles in just a minute. And when you read the Gospels, you get the impression that he was doing this on purpose. It's like he was specifically targeting the Sabbath to heal people when you weren't supposed to work in order to make a point. His point here is, which is more important, to follow a tradition or to save this man's life? No, the guy he healed wasn't about to die or anything, but since just about everybody did manual labor for a living, if you have one hand that doesn't work, you really can't do a lot of living. So this was a big deal. And of course, there's the obvious question, how was Jesus able to heal this man? Now, I'm not talking about the miracle question, I'm talking about in the minds of the people who were living at the time. Again, we'll get to the miracles in just a minute. This wasn't just some mental thing where he convinced this man that he was better. Jesus said, "Stretch out your hand," and the man's hand regrew. Now, assuming that this actually happened, and assuming that you believed in God like the religious leaders claimed, we have to ask the question, who but God had the power to do something like that? Healing a man's hand wouldn't mean that Jesus was God, but in that world, it would mean that Jesus was working for God. It basically meant that God had put his stamp of approval on Jesus. And if a man shows up and is obviously working for God and helping people like this, what does it say about you when you're like, "No, you can't do that. You're supposed to rest on the Sabbath"? Really? You can see why Jesus was angry. And the text says that he was actually angry. What we're meant to draw from this is basically, the implied, what's wrong with you people? Like, can't you recognize when God is working? And if this guy is doing something that doesn't fit in the picture of the God that you have in your heads, which do you think is wrong? Your picture or this guy getting healed? If Jesus can just speak and a man's hand regrows, doesn't that mean he's from God? So shouldn't you listen to him? What's wrong with you? But their reaction was to try to figure out how to destroy him. Remember, in his world, there was no separation between religion and politics. So when Jesus broke what the authorities considered to be a law, he was breaking what they thought was the holy law of God. And that sort of stuff didn't just get you put in prison for a while, it got you killed. So the question is, why didn't Jesus get killed? I mean, he did get killed eventually, but considering how much he can embarrass the religious leaders and prove them wrong at every turn, the question is not, why was Jesus killed? The question is, how did he survive as long as he did? About 3 years. And the answer to that is miracles. Because Jesus performed a lot of miracles, the people thought he was a prophet. So even though the powerful people didn't like him, there were a whole lot more people who did. And there'd be no point in getting rid of Jesus if the people would just get rid of you afterwards. Now, to the question of whether Jesus actually performed miracles. On this, most scholars would say that Jesus performed deeds that many in his day thought were miracles. Notice that I said thought were miracles. I didn't say that most scholars believe that these things that Jesus did were actually miracles. Whether they were or not is another question, but most scholars think that Jesus did things that people thought were miracles. And there's a lot of good reasons to think that he actually did these sorts of things. Probably the best reason is that Jesus' opponents thought he was doing miracles. If you look at Mark 3:22 and following, you can see the religious leaders accusing Jesus of casting out demons by Beelzebul or the Satan. Now, if Jesus were just pulling off these so-called miracles by some sort of trick, and his opponents thought that that's what he was doing, they would have just called him out on the trick. The curtain would have been pulled back, they would have revealed the great and powerful Oz, and Jesus would have been exposed as a phony. So much for the miracle worker. But if you read the passage, you'll notice that that's not what they did. His opponents instead criticized the source of his power, thereby affirming that these things that Jesus was doing seemed to be legit. I mean, think about it. Put yourself in their shoes. If you could expose your opponent as a phony, you would, because that would end the whole thing. But if you can't, you just have to say that he's making this stuff happen by illegitimate means, which is what they tried doing. Again, that means that his opponents thought that Jesus was doing legit miracles. And there's one reason why most scholars think that the historical Jesus did things that many people thought were miracles. Again, just to be abundantly clear, I'm not saying that most scholars believe that Jesus actually did miracles, but they do think that Jesus was doing things that many people in his own time thought were miracles. So that's part of the picture of the historical Jesus. He did things that many people thought were miracles. And that's as far as we're going to go with it in this series. We have to ask the question, was Jesus who he actually claimed to be, before we can think about the question, did he perform actual miracles? Right now we're just saying people thought he did things. So anyway, Jesus did things many people thought were miracles. Question is why? What was the point of doing miracles? Now, the Gospels don't make it sound like he was trying to show off. To some extent, though, while Jesus was not trying to show off, he was demonstrating the power of God was working in him. However, that's not completely the point. The miracles he chose to perform were not random. They were not simply what he thought would impress the people the most, so that they would say, wow, that guy's really being worked through by God. Miracles were all about demonstrating that the kingdom of God was coming. But even more than that, they were not just trying to show that the kingdom of God was coming. Jesus' miracles were actually functioning to really bring in the kingdom of God. Look at the people that Jesus healed. Think of all the people who had some sort of sickness, like leprosy, or physical problem, like the woman with the issue of blood. These people would have been ritually unclean, and as a result, they would have been excluded and separated from membership in Israel. They would have been separated off from their family and friends and would have been unable to have a normal life. And by healing them, Jesus was bringing these people back into Israel. These healings then should be seen in parallel with his welcoming of sinners, tax collectors, and other people of questionable reputation into what Jesus saw as the kingdom of God. Jesus was welcoming all sorts of people who were not previously allowed in, and his miracles were a part of that. He was not merely doing something cool so that people would believe what he was saying. I mean, that was part of it. But by healing people, he was making it possible for those who'd been left on the outside to come back on the inside. Jesus was calling everyone who would listen in to become part of the people of God. And by healing them, he was making it possible for them to actually join everyone else. The other non-healing miracles that he did were also not merely to impress, but to show something about who he was. Again, whether he did these things or not is another question. We're just talking about what the Gospels are portraying him as and what Jesus thought about himself. So, when you think about these miracles, Jesus fed thousands of people in the desert. What this is meant to make us think about is how God miraculously fed his people in the desert. When Jesus calms the wind and the waves or walks on water, we're not meant to merely think of him as super powerful, though again, that was part of the message. We're meant to think back to Genesis and the waters on the earth and how God formed creation. The Gospels are claiming that Jesus had the same power over the waters that God does. They're making comparison of him to God, which is something we'll talk about more in a later episode. So again, these miracles are not meant just to impress. They are meant to make specific points. Now, the last category of miracles that he did that we haven't talked about yet is exorcisms. Jesus cast out demons. The difference with other early Jewish accounts of exorcism is that instead of using mechanical devices or the invocation of an external authority, Jesus did it by his own power. In other words, he didn't have some sort of object that was supposed to have holy powers and relied on that, or some sort of formal prayer or formula to cast out the demons. Jesus just simply said things like, "Come out of him." And like all of his other miracles, the exorcisms Jesus performed were connected with the coming of the kingdom of God. Jesus said in Matthew 12:28, quote, "But if it is by the Spirit of God that I cast out demons, then the kingdom of God has come unto you." End quote. Let me read you a few verses from Mark 3, from the part where Jesus' opponents were accusing him of casting out demons by the power of Beelzebul, or the Satan. And remember, it's not Satan, it's the Satan. Satan isn't a proper name, it's a title that means the adversary. So here's what Mark says. Quote, "And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem were saying, 'He is possessed by Beelzebul, and by the prince of demons he cast out the demons.' And he called to them and said to them in parables, 'How can the Satan cast out the Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if the Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but is coming to an end. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man. Then indeed he may plunder his house." End quote. This is a really important passage, especially that last verse. Jesus is saying that he must first bind the strong man before he plunders his house. The strong man is the Satan, and his goods in his house are the people who are under the power of darkness. Jesus is explaining something very important about his mission, which makes him different than what most people expected of the Messiah. We'll be going over this in more detail in future episodes, but basically Jesus saw his mission as rescuing people from the powers of darkness. And he saw this as a three-stage plan. 1. Bind the Satan. 2. Release the Satan's captives. And 3. Destroy the Satan. This implies that through these acts of power, Jesus was bringing in God's kingdom on earth. Here, we're starting to catch on to the fact that Jesus saw the problem and the opponent differently than the rest of the Jews. Jesus' exorcisms showed that he thought that the real problem was the Satan rather than Rome. And that's something we're going to talk about in the next episode as we begin to take a look at Jesus' teaching.